The transport ship descended through the orange clouds of Kethra. Prime and Commander Vethan watched from the observation deck with his arms crossed over his massive scaled chest. He had received a notification 3 cycles ago that humanity would be sending their first military contribution to the Galactic Coalition war effort, and he had tried to refuse them, but the Coalition Council had overruled his objections. "Let them come," the Council had said. "Every species deserves a chance to prove themselves." Vethan snorted through his nostrils as the human ship touched down on the landing pad, and the vessel was small and ugly compared to the sleek Tarani cruisers that lined the base, and it looked like something a child might build from spare parts. The loading ramp lowered with a hiss of steam, and Vethan straightened his posture as he prepared to greet the new arrivals. What emerged from that ship made him question whether this was some kind of joke. 40 humans walked down the ramp in neat formation, and they were tiny and the tallest among them. Barely reached Vethan's chest, and their skin looked soft and fragile with no scales or armor plating to protect them, and their eyes were small and forward-facing, like prey animals trying to pretend they were predators. The human leading the group saluted with a crisp motion, and he introduced himself as Lieutenant James Cooper, and his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Sir, we are honored to join the Coalition forces, and we are ready to serve in whatever capacity you require." Vethan looked down at the young human, and he could smell the fear on him despite his brave words, and the other humans behind him were even younger, with wide eyes that darted around at the alien base like children visiting a zoo. A deep rumbling laugh came from behind Vethan, and he turned to see General Krethos approaching with 3 other Tarani officers, and their massive bodies shook with amusement. "These are the warriors Earth has sent us," Krethos bellowed. "I have seen hatchlings with more muscle mass." The human lieutenant's face turned red, but he maintained his composure, and his soldiers behind him shifted uncomfortably, but held their formation. Vethan raised a hand to silence the laughter, though he shared the sentiment privately. "You will be assigned to Sector 7, he told the humans. "Logistical support and perimeter patrol of the rear positions." Lieutenant Cooper's jaw tightened slightly, and Vethan could see the disappointment in his eyes. "With respect, Commander, we train for combat operations, and we would like the opportunity to prove ourselves on the front lines." More laughter erupted from the Tarani officers, and even some Kethvari soldiers nearby clicked their mandibles in what passed for amusement among the insectoid species. "The front lines would kill you within minutes," Vethan said flatly. "The Vraxians are not training dummies, and they will not slow down because you are small and fragile, and I will not waste Coalition resources recovering your bodies from a battlefield you have no business being on." He gestured for his aide to escort the humans to their barracks, and as they marched away, he heard the whispers and jokes spreading through the base like wildfire. "Did you see them? They sent children. Earth must hate the Coalition to insult us like this. How do they even survive on their own planet?" Over the following days, the humans tried their best to adapt, but everything was working against them, and the standard-issue plasma rifles were designed for species with larger hands, and the humans struggled to grip them properly, and the body armor hung loose on their frames, and the combat rations made several of them sick. Vethan watched from a distance as the human soldiers ran drills in the training yard, and they were slow compared to the Tarani, and weak compared to the Kethvari, and they had none of the natural weapons that made other species formidable. Lieutenant Cooper pushed his soldiers hard, and Vethan could respect that much at least, but hard work could not overcome biological limitations, and these humans were simply not built for war. One evening, Vethan was reviewing tactical reports when his aide entered with a concerned expression. "Commander, the humans are requesting permission to modify their equipment." Vethan looked up from his display with a raised brow ridge. "Modify? How?" "They want to adjust the rifle grips and alter the armor plating, and they claim they can improve the efficiency of their patrol routes." Vethan considered this for a moment, and then shrugged. Let them tinker if it keeps them busy and out of the way, and perhaps they will feel useful even if they are not. The aide nodded and left, and Vethan returned to his reports and dismissed the humans from his mind. 2 weeks passed and the human unit settled into their role guarding Sector 7, and nothing ever happened in Sector 7 because it was 300 kilometers from the front lines and protected by natural mountain ranges on 2 sides, and the most dangerous thing the humans encountered was the local wildlife lieutenant. Cooper submitted daily reports that Vethan barely glanced at, and the young human still requested combat assignments, but Vethan denied each one without explanation. Then on the 17th day, everything changed. Vethan was awakened in the middle of the night cycle by alarm klaxons, and the base erupted into chaos as soldiers scrambled to their positions, and he stormed into the command center demanding answers. The Vraxians have launched a major offensive, his tactical officer reported. They came through the underground tunnel networks, and they bypassed our front lines entirely. Vethan felt cold dread settle in his stomach as he studied the holographic map, and red enemy markers were appearing deep inside coalition territory. And one cluster of red was heading directly for Sector 7. The humans, he muttered. He opened a communication channel to the human patrol frequency, but all he heard was screaming and weapons fire and the sounds of chaos, and then the channel went dead. Vethan stood frozen as the implications sank in, and he had sent those young soldiers to a safe sector, and he had assured them they would not see combat. And now the Vraxians were tearing through that sector with overwhelming force. 3 hours later, the battle reports began filtering in, and Vethan read each one with a heavy feeling in his chest. 37 human soldiers confirmed dead, and only 3 survivors had escaped into the wilderness, and they were now missing and presumed to be running for their lives. General Krethos entered the command center and read the report over Vethan's shoulder. Expected, he said with a dismissive wave of his clawed hand. The human experiment has concluded, and I will recommend to the council that no further integration be attempted. Vethan said nothing as he stared at the casualty list, and 40 young faces flashed through his memory, and he remembered their eager eyes and their desperate desire to prove themselves. They were just children, he said quietly. They were soldiers, Krethos corrected. And soldiers die in war, and these ones simply died faster than most. He walked away and left Vethan alone with the weight of 40 deaths on his conscience. But far away on a small blue planet called Earth, a distress signal was being received, and in a dark room filled with old soldiers, an old woman read the casualty report, and her face showed no emotion as she set the datapad down. They killed our kids, General Catherine Mercer said, and in that moment the Vraxians made the worst mistake in their entire history. They had drawn the attention of the wolves. The distress beacon pulsed weakly from a cave hidden deep in the mountains of Sector 7, and inside that cave, 3 humans huddled together in the darkness. Corporal Elena Vasquez pressed a blood-stained cloth against the wound on her thigh, and the pain was constant, but she refused to cry out, because crying would give away their position, and the Vraxians were still hunting them. Private First Class Jin Tanaka sat beside her with his back against the cold stone wall, and he was checking their remaining ammunition for the 3rd time, and the count never changed no matter how many times he counted it. 12 rounds between them, and 3 protein bars and 1 damaged communications device that could receive signals but could not send them. Private Okonkwo was posted at the cave entrance, and his young face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, and he had watched 17 of his friends die in the first wave of the attack, and he could still hear their screams echoing in his mind. "We need to move soon," Vasquez whispered. "They will find this cave eventually." Tanaka nodded, but his eyes were hollow, and Vasquez recognized the look because she had seen it in the mirror after her first firefight back on Earth. "What is the point?" Tanaka said quietly. "There are thousands of them out there and 3 of us, and no one is coming for us." Vasquez wanted to argue, but she could not find the words, because part of her agreed with him and they were abandoned and forgotten. And the coalition had written them off as acceptable losses, but she refused to die in a cave feeling sorry for herself. "We keep moving," she said firmly. "We head north toward the coalition lines, and we stay alive until someone comes or until we make it out ourselves." Tanaka met her eyes and slowly nodded, and somewhere deep inside him, a spark of defiance flickered back to life. Far across the galaxy, the distress beacon finally reached Earth, and the signal was weak and garbled, but the message was clear enough. Human unit massacred and 3 survivors and requesting immediate extraction. The message arrived at HiCom headquarters in Geneva at 3 in the morning and the night. Shift officer read it twice before picking up his phone with trembling hands. 20 minutes later, General Catherine Mercer walked through the doors of the command center, and she was 67 years old, with gray hair, cut short and practical, and she walked with a slight limp from a wound she had taken 30 years ago in a jungle that no longer existed. The officers in the room snapped to attention, but she waved them down with an impatient gesture. "Report." The night shift officer handed her a datapad, and she read the casualty list. In silence, and her face remained perfectly still, but something dark and cold began to burn behind her eyes. 40 soldiers sent, she said quietly. 37 dead and 3 missing. Yes, General. Average age of the unit. The officer swallowed nervously before answering, 23 years old. General, and most of them were on their first deployment. Mercer set the datapad down on the table, and she stood there for a long moment staring at nothing, and the room was silent except for the hum of computers. "Get me Admiral Chun and General Okonkwo and Colonel Reeves," she said, "and wake up the 1st Expeditionary Veterans Division." The night shift officer hesitated. "General, the 1st Expeditionary was decommissioned 8 years ago, and most of those soldiers have been retired for decades." Mercer turned to look at him, and her eyes were like chips of ice. "Then we will unretire them." Within hours, the messages began going out across Earth, and they reached quiet homes in suburbs, and farms in the countryside, and apartments in crowded cities, and the recipients were not young soldiers, fresh from training. They were old men and women with gray hair and aching joints and scars that told stories of wars most people had forgotten, and they had thought their fighting days were over. Marcus Oduya was 61 years old, and he was tending his garden in Lagos when his phone rang, and he listened to the message and then set down his tools without a word and walked inside to find his old gear. Sarah Chun was 58, and she was teaching a martial arts class when her watch buzzed, and she read the recall order and dismissed her students early and went home to dig her rifle case out of storage. Viktor Petrov was 64 and missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and he was playing chess in a park in Moscow when a young soldier approached him with sealed orders, and Viktor read them and smiled a terrible smile and knocked over his king in surrender. "The game is over," he told his confused opponent. "I have somewhere to be." Across the planet, 200 veterans answered the call, and they came from every nation and every background, and they had fought in every war Earth had seen in the past 40 years. They gathered at a military base in the middle of the Nevada desert, and they looked at each other with recognition because they all wore the same expression, and it was the expression of wolves who had been awakened from sleep. General Mercer stood before them on a makeshift stage, and she did not give a speech about glory or honor, because these soldiers had no use for such things. "The coalition sent our children to die," she said simply. 40 young soldiers who trusted us to prepare them for what was coming, and 37 of them are dead now, and 3 more are running for their lives on an alien world. She paused and looked out at the assembled veterans, and she saw anger in their eyes, and something else too, and it was a hunger that had been dormant for years. "The aliens think humans are weak because they only saw our young, and we are going to teach them what humanity looks like when it stops being polite." A murmur ran through the crowd, and it was not a sound of agreement, but something deeper and more primal. "We are not going to ask the coalition for permission," Mercer continued. "We are not going to follow their rules or their protocols, and we are going to get our people back, and we are going to make the Vraxians regret ever hearing the name of our species." Sergeant Major Oduya stepped forward from the crowd, and his voice carried across the assembled veterans. "What is the mission, General?" Mercer smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had forgotten what mercy felt like. "Rescue the survivors and kill everyone who stands in our way." The veterans began to move, and they loaded onto transport ships with efficiency, born from decades of practice, and they did not waste time on ceremony or speeches, because there was work to be done as the ships lifted off from Earth and pointed toward the stars. Mercer stood at the viewport and watched her home planet shrink behind them. "We are coming for you," she whispered to the 3 survivors she had never met. "Hold on a little longer." And somewhere in a cave on Kethra, Prime Corporal Elena Vasquez suddenly felt a warmth spread through her chest, and she did not know why, but for the first time since the massacre, she felt something that might have been hope. The wolves were coming. The second human ship arrived at forward base. Kethra, without warning, and Commander Vethan was in the middle of a tactical briefing when his aide burst through the door. "Commander, there is another human vessel requesting landing clearance." Vethan frowned deeply because he had not requested reinforcements, and the coalition had not mentioned any additional human deployments. "Tell them to hold position until I can verify their authorization." "Sir, they are already landing." Vethan pushed past his aide and strode toward the observation deck, and he arrived just in time to see the human ship touch down on the same landing pad as the first one had used weeks ago. This ship was different from the first, and it was larger and covered in scorch marks and patches of welded metal, and it looked like it had been through a dozen battles and survived each one through sheer stubbornness. The loading ramp lowered, and Vethan watched with growing confusion as the passengers emerged. These were not children. The first human down the ramp was a woman with gray hair and cold eyes, and she walked with a slight limp, but her posture was straight and commanding, and behind her came more humans, and they were all old and scarred and weathered by time and experience. Vethan had seen many warriors in his long career, and he knew how to recognize danger when he saw it, and every instinct in his body was suddenly screaming at him that these humans were different. They moved wrong, and their eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings, and they watched rooftops and corners and exits with the automatic paranoia of soldiers who had learned that death could come from anywhere. One man was missing an eye in the socket, was covered by a black patch, and another woman was missing her left arm below the elbow, and it had been replaced with a mechanical prosthetic that she flexed absently as she walked. And a third man had burned scars covering half his face, and he smiled at a young Tyranny guard as he passed, and the guard actually took a step backward. General Mercer approached Vethan, and she stopped directly in front of him and tilted her head back to meet his eyes, and she was a full head shorter than his chest, but somehow she seemed to fill the space around her. "Commander Vethan, I presume?" "Yes, and who are you, and what is the meaning of this unauthorized landing?" "General Catherine Mercer of Earth's 1st Expeditionary Veterans Division, and we are here for our people." Vethan blinked in surprise. "Your people are dead, General, and there are only 3 survivors, and they are lost somewhere in Sector 7, which is now under Vraxian occupation." "I know." "Then you understand that a rescue mission is impossible, and the Vraxians have fortified that entire region with at least 3,000 soldiers." Mercer smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I understand that you believe that." "Commander, General Krethos had arrived during the conversation, and he looked down at the old human woman with the same dismissive attitude he had shown the first group. "This is a waste of time," he announced. "These humans are even older and weaker than the last batch, and what do you think you can accomplish that proper soldiers could not?" Mercer turned to look at the massive Tarani general, and her expression did not change. "Tell me, General, how many wars have you fought?" Krethos puffed up his chest proudly. "I have served in 3 major campaigns against the Vraxian Dominion." 3. Mercer nodded slowly. "Between the soldiers behind me, we have fought in 47 distinct conflicts, and we have operated in every environment imaginable, from frozen wastelands to burning deserts to dense jungles where the enemy could be hiding behind every leaf." She gestured toward her veterans, who had begun unloading equipment from the ship. Sergeant Major Oduya survived a Lagos siege where he held a hospital against enemy forces for 17 days with no resupply, and Dr. Chun was a combat medic in the mountain war where she kept wounded soldiers alive in conditions that should have killed them, and Colonel Petrov was a sniper in the northern campaign with a confirmed kill count that is still classified. Krethos looked uncertain for the first time. "Regardless of your experience," Bethan interjected, "you cannot simply launch an unauthorized military operation in coalition territory." "We are not asking permission, Commander." The words hung in the air, and Bethan felt a chill run down his spine despite his thick scales. "We will require access to your tactical data on Vraxian positions in Sector 7, Mercer continued, "and we'll need a staging area on the perimeter of the occupied zone. And after that, you can forget we exist. And if I refuse," Mercer's smile widened slightly, "then we will obtain the information through other means and proceed anyway, and your refusal will only cost us time that our survivors may not have." Vethan studied the old human woman, and he saw no bluff in her eyes and no hesitation, and he realized that she would do exactly what she said, whether he helped her or not. "I will provide the tactical data," he said finally, "but I will not risk Coalition soldiers on this suicide mission. We never asked you to." The veterans set up their staging area on the edge of the base, and they worked through the night without rest, and Vethan watched from a distance as they modified their equipment. A Tarani engineer named Kethros approached the human camp out of curiosity, and he watched in horrified fascination as they converted standard plasma cells into directional charges. "This violates 17 safety protocols," he said. Sergeant Major Oduya did not look up from his work. "So does war." The veterans stripped down their weapons and rebuilt them with custom modifications, and they sharpened knives and checked sight lines and reviewed maps of the terrain until they could navigate it. Blindfolded Vethan found himself drawn to their camp repeatedly throughout the night, and each time he visited, he saw something that surprised him. These humans were old, and their bodies were clearly worn down by decades of combat, but they moved with a precision and efficiency that put his own soldiers to shame, and there was no wasted motion and no unnecessary conversation, and everything they did served a purpose. At dawn, General Mercer assembled her veterans, and she gave no speech and asked for no volunteers. "Move out," she said. Simply 200 humans marched into the wilderness toward territory held by 3,000 Vraxians, and Commander Vethan watched them go with a strange feeling in his chest. General Krethos appeared beside him. "They are walking to their deaths," he said confidently. "The Vraxians will slaughter them just like the others." Vethan said nothing, but as he watched the last human disappear into the tree line, he found himself wondering if perhaps the Galactic Coalition had underestimated humanity. And somewhere deep in Vraxian-held territory, Corporal Vasquez was still running, and still fighting, and still refusing to die. Help was coming. The wolves had arrived. The Vraxian forward scouts were the first to die, and they never saw it coming. Patrol Unit 7 was moving through the forest on their standard route when the point guard suddenly dropped without a sound, and the soldier behind him looked down in confusion at the body, and then he dropped too. The remaining 3 scouts raised their weapons and scanned the darkness, but there was nothing to see and nothing to shoot. And then something grabbed the nearest Vraxian from behind, and the blade flashed across his throat. The last two scouts ran, but they did not get far. Colonel Victor Petrov emerged from the shadows and cleaned his knife on his sleeve, and he signaled to his team that the route was clear. "First blood," he whispered into his communicator. General Mercer received the report and nodded with satisfaction. Begin Phase 2. The veterans spread out through the forest like ghosts, and they had spent a lifetime learning how to move unseen and how to kill silently, and the jungle on Kethra Prime was not so different from the jungles they had fought in back on Earth. Supply convoys began disappearing, and the Vraxians would send a column of vehicles down a road, and the vehicles would never arrive at their destination. And search parties found only burning wreckage and dead soldiers. Communication relays went dark one by one, and the Vraxian command structure started losing contact with their forward positions, and messages went unanswered, and reinforcement requests vanished into silence. Field Commander Threkver stood in his command tent and stared at the holographic map with growing unease. "What is happening out there?" he demanded. His aide shuffled nervously. "We have lost contact with 12 outposts in the past 2 days, and search teams sent to investigate have not returned. How many enemies are we facing?" "Unknown, Commander, and we have not been able to confirm any sightings." Threkver slammed his fist on the table. 3,000 soldiers. "And we cannot find a handful of humans." He ordered a full patrol sweep of the surrounding area, and he sent 500 warriors into the forest to hunt down the invaders, and he was confident that overwhelming numbers would end this annoyance. Quickly, the patrol sweep found nothing, and then it began losing soldiers. The attacks came at random and followed no pattern that Vraxian tacticians could identify, and sometimes a single soldier would vanish from the middle of a formation, and sometimes an entire squad would be wiped out in seconds. The veterans used every trick from every war in human history. Sergeant Major Oduya led a team that set up ambush corridors using the natural terrain, and Vraxian patrols would pursue what they thought was a retreating human and walk directly into a kill zone where they were cut down from 3 directions. Dr. Chum rigged medical supplies with explosives and left them where wounded Vraxians would find them, and the resulting explosions took out more than just the wounded. Colonel Petrov set up a sniper nest on a ridge overlooking a Vraxian camp, and over 3 days he killed 47 officers, and the enemy never figured out where the shots were coming from. But the most devastating attacks came at night. Humans could see in darkness better than Vraxians, and the veterans had spent decades fighting in conditions where light was a luxury and they owned the night. Vraxian soldiers began refusing to stand guard after sunset, and commanders woke to find their subordinates dead in their tents, and sometimes the bodies were arranged in patterns that seemed designed to send a message. One morning, Threkver emerged from his command tent to find the heads of 6 of his lieutenants arranged in a circle in front of his door, and written in blood on the ground were words in a human language he could not read. He called for a translator, and the translator went pale as she read the message. "What does it say?" "It says we see you sleeping." Threkver felt real fear for the first time in his military career. He sent a transmission to Vraxian High Command requesting immediate withdrawal. "We are not fighting soldiers," he reported. "We are fighting ghosts, and they know the dark better than we do, and they are picking us apart piece by piece, and we cannot stop them." His request was denied, and High Command ordered him to hold his position and eliminate the human threat. Threkver did not live long enough to follow those orders. That night, Colonel Petrov led a team of 12 veterans directly into the heart of the Vraxian Command Center, and they killed everyone they found, and Threkver died with a blade in his throat, staring up at a gray-haired human woman who smiled at him as he bled out, "From Earth with love," Sarah Chun whispered. Meanwhile, Corporal Vasquez and her 2 companions were still surviving, and they had been running for 11 days, and they were starving and exhausted, and Tanaka had developed an infection in his leg that was getting worse by the hour. They had taken shelter in an abandoned structure that might have been a farmhouse before the war, and Vasquez was trying to dress Tanaka's wound with strips torn from her uniform. When she heard something outside, she grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, and she peered out into the darkness, expecting to see Raxian hunters finally catching up to them. Instead, she saw a single human figure emerge from the tree line. The figure raised one hand and made a gesture, and it was 3 short movements followed by 2 long ones, and Vasquez recognized it immediately because it was an old Earth military signal that meant friendlies approaching. She wanted to cry, but she could not afford the luxury. The figure came closer, and Vasquez could see now that it was an older man with dark skin and gray hair, and he was covered in what looked like dried Raxian blood, and he was smiling. Sergeant Major Oduya reached the farmhouse and pushed open the door, and he looked at the 3 young survivors with an expression that combined pride and sorrow. "Corporal Vasquez," he said, "I am Sergeant Major Marcus Oduya of the 1st Expeditionary Veterans Division, and I am here to take you home." Vasquez finally let the tears fall. "We thought no one was coming." Oduya knelt beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. "Kid, we will always come, and that is what family does." He helped Tanaka to his feet and supported the wounded soldier with one arm, and he led the 3 survivors out into the night, where more veterans were waiting to escort them to safety. "What about the Vraxians?" Private Okonkwo asked. "There are thousands of them." Sergeant Major Oduya grinned. "There were thousands of them." Behind them in the distance, the Vraxian occupation force was collapsing, and soldiers were deserting their posts, and officers were dying in their beds, and 3,000 had become 2,000, had become 1,000, had become whatever was left. The wolves had been hunting, and the hunt was almost over. The surviving Vraxians ran for the border, and they abandoned their weapons and their equipment and their dignity, and they ran, because staying meant death. 400 soldiers remained from the original 3,000, and they were broken and terrified, and they fled through the only escape route left open to them, and they thought they might actually make it to safety. They were wrong. General Mercer had studied the terrain for days before the operation began, and she knew exactly which routes the Vraxians would use when they finally broke, and she had placed her people accordingly. The escape route led through a narrow canyon, and the Vraxians poured into it like water through a funnel, and when they were halfway through the canyon, walls erupted with weapons fire. It was over in minutes. Colonel Petrov lowered his rifle and looked down at the canyon floor where nothing moved anymore. "That is the last of them." General Mercer nodded and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. "Gather our wounded and prepare to return to base." The 1st Expeditionary Veterans Division assembled at the extraction point, and they counted their losses, and 19 veterans had died during the 11-day campaign, and their bodies were wrapped in makeshift shrouds and carried by their comrades. 19 deaths to rescue 3 survivors and eliminate 3,000 enemies, and by any military calculation, it was an overwhelming success. But Mercer felt each of those 19 losses like a physical wound. She knew all their names, and she knew their stories, and she would carry them with her for whatever time she had left to march back to forward base Kethra. Took 2 days, and when the veterans finally emerged from the wilderness, they found the entire coalition garrison waiting for them. Commander Vethan stood at the front of the assembled soldiers, and his expression was unreadable as he watched the humans approach. General Mercer walked at the head of her column with the 3 survivors beside her, and Corporal Vasquez was limping, but she refused to be carried, and Private Tanaka was supported by 2 veterans, but he was alive, and Private Okonkwo walked with his head held high despite everything he had been through. The veterans stopped in front of Vethan, and there was a long moment of silence. "You did it," Vethan said finally. "You actually did it." "Yes. 3,000 Vraxians. Approximately 400 escaped into the initial assault before we could establish containment, but we tracked them down." Vethan shook his head slowly, and his scales rippled with an emotion that might have been disbelief or respect, or both. How is this possible? And your first group was slaughtered, and they were young and fast, and you are old and slow? And how did you defeat an enemy that destroyed them? Mercer considered the question for a moment before answering. Our first group was our future, and they were the best of us, and they were learning to be part of something bigger than humanity, and they were full of hope and potential, and you dismissed them because they were small and soft. She paused and looked back at her veterans, who stood in silent rows behind her. We are the past, and we are the ones who learned to survive when nothing else could, and we kept fighting when fighting was all we had left, and we are small and soft, too, but we have spent our entire lives learning how to kill things bigger and harder than us. General Krethos pushed his way through the crowd, and he looked at the human veterans with an expression that was very different from the contempt he had shown before. You destroyed an entire occupation force, he said, with 200 soldiers, and most of them older than my father. Your father probably did not spend 40 years learning how to be the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. Krethos was silent for a long moment. I mocked your young soldiers, he said finally, and I dismissed them as weak and useless, and I was wrong. Mercer met his eyes. Yes, you were. The coalition underestimated humanity. Everyone does. She turned to leave, but Vethan called out to her. General Mercer, wait. She stopped and looked back. Your species has been classified as a minor contributing member of the coalition, and after what I have witnessed, I intend to recommend the classification be changed. To what? Strategic military asset and full combat integration with coalition forces, if humanity chooses to accept. Mercer smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had shown since arriving on Kethra Prime. I will relay your recommendation to Earth, and I suspect they will be pleased. She continued walking, and her veterans fell in behind her, and they marched toward the human ship that would take them. Corporal Vasquez walked beside General Mercer, and she was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. General, why did you come for us and 3 survivors? Against 3,000 enemies, and it should have been impossible. Mercer did not slow her pace. Because you are ours, and we do not leave our people behind, and we never have, and we never will. 37 of us died. I know, and I know all their names, and I will remember them until the day I die, and so will every veteran who fought here. Vasquez felt tears threatening again. They laughed at us, and they put us in a safe sector, and they thought we were weak. And now they know better. The human ship lifted off from Kethra Prime and pointed toward the stars and inside the passenger compartment. The 3 survivors sat among the veterans, and for the first time since the massacre they felt safe. General Mercer sat alone near a viewport and watched the alien world shrink behind them, and she thought about the 40 young soldiers who had come here with such hope, and the 37 who would never go home. I'm sorry we were too late for most of you, she whispered. But we got the ones we could, and we made them pay for every single one of you. 6 months later, the Vraxian Dominion sued for a ceasefire with the Galactic Coalition, and their official statement mentioned many factors in their decision, but everyone knew the real reason. The humans. The Coalition granted humanity full military integration, and Earth began training the next generation of soldiers, and this time they would be prepared for what awaited them in the stars and in veterans' halls across the planet. Old soldiers gathered to raise their glasses and remember. To the kids we lost, they said, and to the ones who will never be lost again. Sergeant Major Oduya sat in his garden in Lagos and tended his flowers, and sometimes he thought about the 3 young soldiers he had pulled out of hell, and he wondered what they were doing now. Corporal Vasquez had been promoted too. Lieutenant, and she was training new recruits and teaching them what she had learned in those 11 days of running and hiding and surviving. She always ended her lectures the same way. The universe will underestimate you because you are human and you are small and soft and fragile. compared to most species, and let them underestimate you, and let them laugh. And when they are done laughing, show them why humanity survived when so many other species did not. Her recruits always listened, and they always remembered, because somewhere out there the wolves were still watching, and they would always come for their own.